Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 12th of September 2020 of the New Delhi edition. The topics to be discussed today has been presented on your screen. Timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let us begin our today's discussion. Now coming to the first article, in today's newspaper we have three important articles related to the recent 5-point action plan that has been signed by India and China in order to resolve the border dispute. Now these three articles appear on page number 1, page number 6 as an editorial as well as on page number 9. Now before discussing this particular article in detail, let us first look into its background. As you all must be aware, the tensions along the line of actual control have got escalated in the recent days. There has been massive Chinese deployment along the northern bank of the Pangong Lake. As you can see here, prior to the border standoff, the Chinese troops were stationed at the Finger 8 area, which lies along the northern bank of the Pangong Lake. However, after the border standoff, the Chinese have moved in at least 8 kilometers inside the line of actual control, and its troops as such are presently deployed along the Finger 4 area. Apart from that, in the last 4 to 5 days, at least 2,000 Chinese soldiers have been deployed along the Finger 4 area. In response, what India has been doing is, India has been trying to match its troop presence with the Chinese troop presence along the Finger 3 area. So as you can see here, the Indian troops and the Chinese troops are involved in eyeball to eyeball confrontation, and they are in firing range of each other. Apart from that, so far the tensions in the line of actual control were confined to the northern bank of the Pangong Lake. The southern bank of the Pangong Lake so far was peaceful. However, on the night of August 29th, the Chinese army tried to take control of some of the strategic heights along the southern bank of Pangong Lake, which was in turn prevented by the Indian army. So on the night of August 29, the Indian army has occupied the strategic heights along the southern bank of the Pangong Lake. Some of these strategic heights include the Black Top, Helmet Top, some of the important passes such as the Rezanglaw, Rechinlaw, the Chushul Valley, the strategic Spangur Gap, and so on. Now question is to why this particular sector is considered to be quite significant. Now this particular sector has got wide plains, which makes it easier for the Indian army to deploy mechanized forces including the tanks. Further, these areas, as you can see here, they are connected to the city of Leh, and hence this makes it easier for the Indian army to rapidly deploy its troops in this particular region. And more importantly, since these areas are located at a higher heights, this makes it easier for the Indian army to keep a tab on the Chinese presence in this particular region. So in response to control of these areas under the Indian army, the Chinese army has been taking a number of provocative actions in this particular region. So far, the Indian army has responded in a matured and a responsible manner. Apart from that, after the Indo-China 1962 war, a number of border agreements have been signed between India as well as China in order to ensure peace and tranquility along the line of actual control. However, in the recent days, there has been repeated violation of these border agreements by the Chinese army. Now, this is evident in the recent firing of the gunshots for the first time in the last 45 years, the death of the Indian soldiers in the Galwan Valley clash, which happened in June 2020, and a violation of number of protocols by the Chinese PLA. So it was behind this particular backdrop, the foreign ministers of India as well as China have met recently on the sidelines of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, which was held in Russia. Now, this face-to-face meeting between the foreign ministers of the two countries was considered to be quite significant in order to ease the tensions and ensure peace along the line of actual control. At the end of the meeting, India and China have come out with a 5-point action plan to quickly disengage the troops and ease the tensions along the border. Hence, the very fact that these two countries came out with a joint press statement in order to diffuse the tensions shows that both of them are willing to engage with each other and address some of the common concerns. Hence, undoubtedly, this is a glimmer of hope. But at the same time, a number of concerns and challenges still remain. Hence, as part of this video analysis, we'll understand as to what are the broad contours of the 5-point action plan between India and China, and to what extent would it be able to address the present border dispute between the two countries. Now, coming to the broad aspects of the 5-point action plan, first and foremost, both the countries have highlighted that they would not allow their differences to turn into disputes. Now, this essentially means that both the countries recognize that differences are bound to arise between them. However, at the same time, these differences as such have to be resolved diplomatically so that they do not turn into unresolvable disputes. Secondly, the two foreign ministers also agreed that the present ground situation in the border areas is not in the best interest of either India or, for that matter, China. Hence, they agreed that the border troops of both the sides should continue their dialogue, quickly disengage, maintain proper distance, and ease tensions. Now, with respect to maintaining proper distance, as highlighted before, the Indian and Chinese troops are involved in eyeball to eyeball confrontation and they are in the firing range of each other. Hence, there is a need to maintain proper distance and quickly disengage from the present border position in order to ensure peace along the line of actual control. The two countries also decided to abide by all the existing agreements that have been put in place in order to ensure the peace and tranquility along the line of actual control. Both India and China have agreed to continue with the present dialogue and communication mechanism, which is done through the special representative mechanism and the working mechanism for the consultation and coordination on the India-China matters. And lastly, it has been agreed that as the situation along the line of actual control eases, both India and China would try to focus on new confidence building measures to enhance peace and tranquility in the border areas. So let us evaluate to what extent this 5-point action plan would be able to ensure peace along the line of actual control. First, coming to the positives of the 5-point action plan. Now, in spite of the growing escalation between the two countries, the mere fact that these two countries have come together, discussed ways and means to address the standoff, and come out with a joint statement highlights that both these countries want peace as well as tranquility along the border. Further, apart from the joint statement, China has also come out with a separate press statement. Now, in the earlier press statement, China was highly critical of India and entirely blamed India for the present border standoff. However, in the recent press statement that was issued yesterday, China has significantly toned down on criticizing India. The tone against India in the press statement is not so harsh as it used to be earlier. Now, what do these two things mean for India? How should we interpret these signals coming from China? Now, in response to the border standoff, India has adopted a multifaceted approach involving diplomatic, military, and economic in order to deal with China. The Indian government has unambiguously and categorically stated that the border dispute with China would be linked to the border Indo-China relationship. Now, what this essentially means that unless the border dispute resolves, we cannot continue to have the normal relations with China. So, by linking the border dispute to the wider Indo-China relationship, Indian government has taken a number of steps to economically punish China and decouple the Indian economy from the Chinese economy. Now, for example, the Indian government has tightened the FDI norms to restrict the investment from the Chinese companies. It has increased the customs duty on the Chinese goods. The Indian government has cancelled the projects that were earlier allocated to the Chinese companies. It has also banned a number of Chinese apps such as TikTok, PUBG, etc. So in a way, India has been trying to economically bleed China. Now it is to be noted that such strategies were not adopted by the Indian government to deal with China during the previous border standoffs such as over the Doklam. It is only during the recent border standoff that India has adopted such a multifaceted approach. So the mere fact that China has been willing to negotiate and China has toned down on its criticism of India in its separate press statement highlights that these strategies may have actually worked to India's advantage. Now, in spite of this, still a number of concerns as well as challenges still remain. Now, for example, while dealing with China, we must always learn from our past mistakes. Now, history tells us that both credibility as well as optimism are usually not the words which can be associated with China. We must learn from the history and never be too optimistic and trust China. Now, we do know that when the border standoff started, China has always been willing to negotiate. But at the same time, China has been carrying out military adventurism, violating the previous agreements, and occupying the previously unoccupied areas such as the Depsan Plains, Finger Four area, and so on. So, on one hand, China's diplomats give commitment to India that it would withdraw its troops, but on the other hand, Chinese PLA deceptively and silently tries to occupy the areas, involve in unnecessary military provocation, violate the agreements, and escalate the tensions between the two countries. So, in a way, history must act as a guide for us to deal with China. We must learn from our past mistakes and take appropriate strategy to deal with China. We cannot afford to take China on its face value. Rather, we need to see to what extent China will be able to abide by the 5-point action plan. Secondly, there is no statement on the withdrawal of the Chinese troops and return to the status quo prior to the border standoff. So unless that happens, the line of actual control will always be on boil. Nextly, in next 2 to 3 months, winter would be setting in the areas which are presently occupied by the Indian and the Chinese soldiers. Hence, it would become a logistical challenge for India to maintain its troops in the strategic heights along the line of actual control. We must be mindful of the fact that continued presence of the Indian troops in this particular area, even during the winter, would mean that this area would emerge as another Siachen glacier for us. Hence, there is a need to find a resolution to this particular border dispute before the winter sets in. And lastly, in its separate press statement, China has come out with statements which are completely in conflict with India's stand. Now, this clearly highlights that both these countries have failed to achieve consensus on a number of core issues. Now, for example, in its press statement, China has highlighted that India does not consider the relationship between the two countries to be dependent upon the resolution of the border dispute. Now, this is in clear contrast to India's stand that there cannot be a business as usual approach unless the border dispute resolves. But the question is, why is China saying so? This in a way highlights that China wants to normalize its relationship with India in order to resume trade and investment and boost its economy. But at the same time, China is not willing, at least in the near term, to find a peaceful resolution of the border dispute at the earliest. Secondly, India believes that China has changed its approach while dealing with the line of actual control. So, India believes that it is the aggressive military posture taken by China along the line of actual control that has led to the border standoff. On the other hand, China believes that its behavior while dealing with the line of actual control has remained unchanged. So even today, China still blames India for the border dispute which has presently taken place. So in our final evaluation, we can say that the agreement on the 5-point action plan shows that India and China have at least something to agree upon. But as they say, proof of the pudding is in eating. This means that the success of the 5-point action plan would ultimately depend upon how well it is implemented and to what extent China would abide by the commitments that it has given in the 5-point action plan. And as highlighted before, credibility and optimism are rarely used in reference to China. Hence, India needs to be cautious of China's design on the line of actual control and be appropriately prepared to deal with the Chinese incursions in future. Now, the next article appears on page number 15 and is titled as Gujarat emerges best for the startups again. Now, before you read this particular article, I would advise you to test yourself through these questions as to whether you know the answers to these questions or not. For example, do you know the definition of the startup, the various initiatives taken by the government to boost the startups, whether the Startup India scheme is implemented by the Ministry of Finance, yes or no, and so on. I will be giving the answers to these questions at the end of our discussion. Apart from that, this particular article that we are going to discuss is also important because in prelims 2016, two related questions on the Stand Up India scheme as well as Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana have already been asked. Accordingly, one can expect a question related to the Startup India scheme. So let us find out the answers to these questions which have been highlighted. Firstly, coming to the definition of the startups, recently in the year 2019, the Department for Promotion of Industry and Internal Trade has changed the definition of the startup. Earlier, a company was considered as a startup for a period of 7 years after its incorporation. Apart from this, during any of these 7 years, the annual turnover of the company was supposed to be below 25 crores in order to be considered as a startup. So, if the annual turnover of a company during any of these 7 years crossed the threshold of rupees 25 crores, then such a company was no longer considered as a startup company. Now, this particular definition of the startup company has undergone change both in terms of duration as well as turnover. Since this particular change has undertaken in the year 2019, it becomes quite important for your upcoming prelims examination. Now, presently, a company is considered to be a startup for a period of 10 years after its incorporation. Apart from that, during any of these 10 years, the annual turnover of the company should be below 100 crores. So, during any of the 10 years, if the annual turnover of the company exceeded the threshold of rupees 100 crores, then such a company will no longer be considered as a startup company. Now, one of the biggest initiatives of the government of India to boost the startup ecosystem is the Startup India scheme. Now, this particular scheme is implemented by the Department of Promotion for Industry and Internal Trade, which is working under the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. Now, the benefits given to the startups under this particular scheme is 3-year income tax exemption, self-certification based compliance regime. Under this, the startup companies simply have to self-certify that they are following all the norms and regulations related to labor, environmental laws, etc. And this in turn reduces their compliance burden. Then we have the Startup India web portal, where all the necessary information related to the benefits available to the startups in India has been provided. Next is the relaxed norms for the public procurement. See, whenever the government undertakes a public procurement, wherein the government is procuring goods and services from certain companies, the government may lay down rules and regulations stating that a particular company should have certain minimum years of experience before supplying goods and services to the Indian government. However, such kind of stipulations of the government with respect to minimum years of experience for a company to supply goods and services may go against the interest of the startup company. So in some of the cases, the government may relax these norms in order to enable the startup companies to provide goods and services to the government. Then we have the state's startup ranking framework. The state startup ranking framework is published by the Department for Promotion of Industry and Internal Trade. This basically ranks the states as well as union territories based upon the ecosystem which they have created in order to nurture and promote the startups. So this in a way seeks to promote the competitive federalism in India and encourage the states to create a conducive ecosystem which can lead to the development of the startups. In order to rank the states, the Department for Promotion of Industry and Internal Trade take into account the 7 broad reform areas consisting of 30 action points such as the institutional support, easing compliances, etc. With respect to what are these reform areas or the action points, these are not important from the prelims perspective, so you can leave out this aspect. Now, under this particular report, the states are categorized into 5 different categories, that is best performers, top performers, leaders, aspiring leaders and emerging startup ecosystems, depending upon the steps which they have taken in order to promote the startups. Now, if you look at the latest ranking which was published yesterday, the best performing state happens to be Gujarat and the top performing states happen to be Karnataka followed by Kerala. Nextly, we have the fund of funds for the startups. So let us understand as to what do you exactly mean by the fund of funds. I hope all of you must be aware about the concept of the alternate investment fund. See, the alternate investment fund basically pools in money from different categories of investors, and then the pooled money is invested in the different financial instruments such as shares, bonds, debentures. The money may also be invested in real estate, infrastructure projects and so on. So we have a separate category of alternate investment fund known as the venture capital funds. As the name suggests, this particular alternate investment fund pools in money from different categories of investors. The pooled money is then invested in the startup companies. That is why we have the name venture capital fund. So with respect to fund of funds, the government of India has created a fund of fund for the startups under the control of SIDBI in order to indirectly provide funding to the startup companies. Now, in case of fund of fund, SIDBI as such provides funding to various alternate investment funds which are categorized as the venture capital funds. Now, such an alternate investment fund also pools in money from different categories of investors. So, in a way, this particular venture capital fund pools in money from the government in the form of the fund of funds. It also pools in money from different categories of investors. The pooled money is then invested into the startup companies. So as you can see, through the fund of funds, the government as such is not directly providing the funding to the startup companies. The funding is instead provided to the alternate investment funds which are categorized as the venture capital funds. That is why the fund of funds are called as the father funds, whereas the alternate investment funds are called as the daughter funds. Apart from that, the leverage ratio in case of the fund of funds for the startups has been mentioned at 1:2. So what this essentially means is how much ever money is provided to a venture capital fund by the fund of funds, almost twice that amount has to be invested by all other investors put together. Now, for example, let's say in this particular case, SIDBI through the fund of funds is providing 50,000 rupees to an alternate investment fund. So, as you can see, the leverage ratio is 1:2. That means all these investors A, B and C together have to make an investment that is twice the government investment. That is, in this case, rupees 1 lakh. Similarly, let's say the SIDBI is providing an investment of rupees 1 lakh to a venture capital fund. Then the investors A, B and C should put together rupees 2 lakh. That is why we say the leverage ratio in case of the fund of fund for the startups is 1:2. Nextly, we have the Stand Up India scheme. Now, under the Stand Up India scheme, the idea is to provide loans between 10 lakh to 1 crore to at least one scheduled caste or scheduled tribe and at least one woman per bank branch in order to set up a new enterprise. So the idea behind the Stand Up India scheme is to bring the poor and marginal sections of the Indian society into the formal credit system and improve the financial inclusion. See, as stated before, the Startup India scheme is implemented by the Department for Promotion of Industry and Internal Trade. Please find out as to who implements the Stand Up India scheme and let us know your response in the comment section given below. Next, we have the Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana, wherein the idea of this particular scheme is to provide loans of up to rupees 10 lakhs to non-corporate, non-farm, small or the micro enterprises. Now, under the Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana, the loans may be extended by the commercial banks, regional rural banks, small finance banks, microfinance institutions, as well as NBFCs. So with respect to prelims, please note that the Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana is not only applicable to the commercial banks and RRBs, but it is also equally applicable to the small finance banks, microfinance institutions, as well as the NBFCs. Now this is considered to be quite tricky and hence can be targeted by the UPSC in order to confuse students. And lastly, the loans provided by these banks under the Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana are in turn refinanced by the Mudra Bank. So the answers to the questions posed before the start of the discussion has been provided in the front of your screen. As far as the question 5 is concerned, I would want you to find the answer to this particular question and respond in the comments section. Next, we have an article on page number 15. Now, this particular article highlights that the central government has released almost around 6,200 crores in the form of the post-devolution revenue deficit grant to almost around 14 states in India. Now, before going through the analysis of this particular article, I would recommend you to test yourself through these 8 questions. For example, whether the surcharge and cess collected by the center, is it part of the central divisible pool of taxes? What do you mean by the post-devolution grants by the Finance Commission, and so on. Apart from that, the article that we are going to discuss here is also important because in previous year prelims, questions have been asked directly with respect to the Finance Commission. So as part of this video analysis, we'll understand the recommendations of the 15th Finance Commission, and through such a discussion, we'll also find out the answers to these questions as well. As you all must be aware, the Finance Commission is a constitutional body that has been created under Article 280 of the Indian Constitution. The Finance Commission is appointed by the President every 5 years or earlier, and usually the recommendations of the Finance Commission are applicable for a period of 5 years. So what exactly is the mandate of the Finance Commission? See, under Article 280 of the Indian Constitution, the Finance Commission is required to give recommendations with respect to the vertical distribution of taxes from the center to the states, the horizontal distribution of the taxes among the multiple states in India, and the recommendations with respect to grants to be given to the different states. As you know, India is a federal country wherein the power to impose taxes have been distributed between the center and the states. Some of the taxes which are imposed by the central government include the income tax, corporate tax, customs duty, etc. Whereas some of the taxes that are imposed and collected by the state government include the property tax, professional tax, excise duty on liquor, and so on. Now, the taxes that are collected by the state government are quite insufficient in order to meet their constitutional requirements. Apart from that, if you look at some of the most important taxes in countries such as the income tax, corporate tax, etc., they have been assigned to the central government. So what we need to do here is we need to provide for the transfer of finances from the center to the states in order to enable the states to fulfill their constitutionally mandated duties. That is where the central divisible pool of taxes come into picture. So central divisible pool of taxes basically includes all the union taxes which are imposed and collected by the center. So these taxes include the income tax, corporate tax, customs duty, capital gains tax, and almost all other major union taxes. But from the perspective of prelims, please note that the central divisible pool of taxes do not include the cess and the surcharge that is collected by the union government. Now, for example, with respect to income tax, the government of India collects the education and health cess as well as the surcharge on income tax. Now, both this cess as well as surcharge on income tax are not part of the central divisible pool of taxes. That means this particular money which the central government collects, that entire money goes only to the center. Whereas the money that the center collects in the form of income tax, that becomes part of the central divisible pool of taxes, and this money in turn has to be shared with the state governments. So with respect to prelims, please note this important fact that cess and surcharge which are collected by the central government are not shared with the states, whereas all the major central taxes are required to be shared with the state government. So the first recommendation of the Finance Commission is to decide on what percentage of the central divisible pool of taxes will remain with the center and what percentage of this central divisible pool of taxes has to be transferred to the states. So as you can see, the 12th Finance Commission had recommended that 30.5% of the central divisible pool of taxes has to be transferred to the states. This was increased to 32% by the 13th Finance Commission. This further got increased to 42% by the 14th Finance Commission, whose recommendations were applicable for a period 2015 to 2020, which means out of the total central divisible pool of taxes, 42% were transferred to the states and remaining 58% remained with the union government. Now, as far as the 15th Finance Commission is concerned, the 15th Finance Commission has been asked by the government to submit two reports, wherein the first report is applicable for the time duration 2020-21, and this report has already been submitted by the 15th Finance Commission, whereas the second report would be applicable for the time duration 2021 to 2026. So as you can see, the recommendations of the earlier Finance Commission were applicable for a period of 5 years. But as far as the 15th Finance Commission is concerned, its recommendations will be applicable for a period of 6 years. And as far as the year 2020-21 is concerned, the 15th Finance Commission has reduced the share of the state taxes from 42% to 41%. Now, this particular reduction in the share of the state taxes can basically be attributed to breaking up of the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir into two union territories. So, since the number of states has got reduced, accordingly, the share of the states has got reduced from 41% to 41%. The second part of the report that will be applicable for the time duration 2021-2026 is so far not yet submitted by the 15th Finance Commission. Next, we have the horizontal distribution of taxes among the different states. Now, just ask yourself as to whether this particular share of the states, should it be equally divided among the different states or not. Now, we do know that different states are at different levels of development. Different states have different requirements. For example, this requirement of the government of Tripura, this requirement may be quite different from the requirement of the government of Maharashtra. Similarly, the requirement of the state of UP is quite different from the requirement of the state of Kerala. This is primarily on the account of the fact that UP has a much higher population as compared to Kerala. Similarly, if you compare Tripura and Maharashtra, Tripura is considered to be less developed as compared to Maharashtra. So ideally, we need to take into account some criteria in order to divide this particular share of the state's taxes among the different states. So if you look at the criteria that was adopted by the 14th Finance Commission, the 14th Finance Commission had adopted population of 1971, population of 2001, area of the state, forest cover, and the income distance. Now, as far as the income distance is concerned, here we take into account the per capita income of a particular state and then compare this with the per capita income of the richest state in India. So the difference between the per capita income of a particular state and the richest state is quite higher. Then this means that this particular state is quite poor. On the other hand, if the difference is quite lower, then this means that this particular state is quite richer. So accordingly, a poor state would get higher funds from the Finance Commission, whereas a richer state would get less funds from the Finance Commission. Now, for example, let's say we have Maharashtra on one hand and Chhattisgarh on the other hand. Now, the per capita income of Maharashtra with the per capita income of a richer state would be quite lower, and accordingly, Maharashtra would get less funds from the Finance Commission. On the other hand, Chhattisgarh would get much higher funds. Now, this was the criteria which was followed by the 14th Finance Commission. Now, the 15th Finance Commission has completely done away with the population criteria of 1971 census. Instead, it is taking into account only the population of 2011 census. Introduce the concept of demographic performance as well as the tax efforts. See, as far as the demographic performance is concerned, here the 15th Finance Commission is looking at the fertility rate of a particular state. Fertility rate, as you know, refers to how many number of children a woman is expected to give birth to during her reproductive years. So, if the fertility rate in a particular state is quite lower, then this means that a state has taken more efforts in order to bring its population under its control. Accordingly, such a state is rewarded with higher transfer of finances from the Finance Commission. On the other hand, if the fertility rate of a particular state is still higher, this means that a state has taken less efforts to control the population, and hence such a state would get less funds from the Finance Commission. So this idea of demographic performance has been introduced in order to incentivize the states to reduce their population growth rate. Similarly, we have taken into account the parameter of tax efforts, wherein we are measuring the efforts taken by the state governments in order to improve their tax to GDP ratio. The next set of recommendations of the Finance Commission is related to the recommendations of the transfer of grants to the states, wherein the first set of grant is referred to as the revenue deficit grant, which is also known as the post-devolution grants. So what exactly are the post-devolution grants? Now let's say the Finance Commission has recommended for the transfer of rupees 100 to a particular state. Now this rupees 100 which is transferred to a particular state is part of the horizontal distribution of the taxes. Now it may so happen that even after the transfer of these rupees 100 to a particular state, a state government may have a revenue deficit of say rupees 20. Now the very fact that this particular state is having a revenue deficit of rupees 20 means that such a state is unable to meet its own expenses from the taxes that it gets. Accordingly, the Finance Commission then recommends the center to transfer this rupees 20 to the state government so that the state government is able to meet its revenue expenditure, and thus it ensures that the revenue deficit of a state would become equal to zero. Now this particular approach that is followed by the Finance Commission is also referred to as the gap filling approach, wherein the Finance Commission is basically trying to fill in the gap of the revenue deficit. So for a particular state, the revenue deficit may be rupees 20, for another state the revenue deficit may be rupees 15, for another state it could be rupees 5. So in each of these cases, this particular gap is filled through the transfer of the post-devolution grants on the basis of the recommendations of the Finance Commission. Other important grants are related to the grants to the local bodies, sector-specific grants, and grants for the disaster risk management. So here are the answers to the questions which we had displayed at the start of our discussion. As far as the question number 7 and 8 is concerned, I would want you to find out the answers to these questions on your own. With this, let us now take up the next article. Now, the next article appears on the editorial page. Now, this particular article has appeared in the newspaper in the context of the recent Supreme Court judgment with respect to the eviction of the slum dwellers who are living along the railway tracks in Delhi. In this regard, this particular article here provides a critique of the recent Supreme Court judgment with respect to the eviction of the slum dwellers. So the article that we are going to discuss here shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 2, Polity and Governance. Recently, the Supreme Court of India was hearing a case referred to as the MC Mehta versus Union of India case. Now, this particular case had come up before the Supreme Court based upon a report which had highlighted about the piling up of the garbage along the railway tracks in Delhi. So this particular case was basically filed before the Supreme Court of India in order to address the problem of the pollution along the railway tracks in Delhi. Now recently on August 31st, the Supreme Court of India has delivered its verdict in the MC Mehta versus the Union of India case. In this particular case, Supreme Court of India has ordered the eviction of almost around 48,000 slum dwellers who are residing along the railway tracks in Delhi. The Supreme Court was of the opinion that the presence of slums along the railway tracks had led to the growing problem of pollution. Hence, the solution given by the Supreme Court is to evict these slum dwellers. The Supreme Court not only ordered the eviction of the slum dwellers, but the Supreme Court also ruled that no court can grant a stay on the eviction of the slum dwellers. So in a way, the Supreme Court has highlighted that whatever verdict it has given with respect to the eviction of the slum dwellers, this particular verdict is final and it cannot be challenged before any court. Now, based upon this particular Supreme Court judgment, which was delivered on August 31st, the author of this particular article has highlighted that there are a number of legal flaws in the Supreme Court judgment. The author argues that the Supreme Court order is fundamentally flawed because the court as such has ignored the principles of natural justice, it has ignored the judicial precedents and the present policies and rehabilitation, and such a Supreme Court judgment would cause more amount of hardship to the poor people during this COVID-19 pandemic. With respect to the first fundamental flaw, first and foremost, see here, the Supreme Court of India has delivered a verdict which would lead to the eviction of the slum dwellers. Accordingly, as the principles of natural justice say, these slum dwellers should have been given an opportunity to be heard. However, while delivering this particular verdict, the Supreme Court has not heard the viewpoints of the slum dwellers. So this in a way is violation of the principles of natural justice which the Supreme Court steadfastly is committed to. Secondly, the author of this particular article also highlights that to a certain extent the Supreme Court verdict in this particular case is a case of judicial overreach. See, when this particular case was filed before the Supreme Court, this case was never about the encroachment of the railway lands by the slum dwellers. This case was more about the piling up of the garbage along the railway tracks. But what the Supreme Court has done is, it has linked the case of the urban pollution to the encroachment of the railway lands and has accordingly ordered for the eviction of the slum dwellers. Nextly, see, whenever the Supreme Court delivers a particular verdict, such a verdict becomes a precedence, and this particular precedence is in turn applied to the future cases as well. So normally whatever verdict the Supreme Court has given in the past, this verdict is used as a reference while delivering the verdict in the future cases. Now earlier, in a landmark decision concerning the pavement dwellers, a 5-judge bench of the Supreme Court in the Olga Tellis and others versus the Bombay Municipal Corporation held that right to life, which is provided under Article 21 of the Indian Constitution, also includes the right to livelihood. Further, the Supreme Court had also ruled that no eviction of the people would take place without giving due notice and without following the principles of natural justice. Secondly, in a landmark case known as Ajay Makin and others versus the Union of India, the Delhi High Court had invoked the idea of right to city, which in a way showed that even the slum dwellers have a right to live in a city just as the other city dwellers. Thirdly, in the Sudama Singh and others versus the government of Delhi, the Delhi High Court had clearly stated that in case of any eviction, first and foremost, a survey has to be carried out, a rehabilitation plan has to be brought out, and while formulating such a rehabilitation plan, there should be meaningful engagement with the slum dwellers. Now, this particular verdict of the Delhi High Court was later incorporated into the Delhi Slum and Rehabilitation and Relocation Policy 2015. But as seen in the recent Supreme Court judgment, the recent Supreme Court judgment goes against the judicial precedents as set under Sudama Singh and others versus Government of Delhi. It is also against the present policy on rehabilitation of the slum dwellers. And lastly, see, we must realize that the COVID-19 pandemic has adversely affected the livelihood of the urban poor. Now, these urban poor are unable to meet their basic needs. So, this particular Supreme Court judgment has come at a time when the urban poor are already reeling under the double impact of the economic slowdown as well as a disruption that is caused due to the pandemic. Hence, this particular Supreme Court judgment would render them homeless and thus cause more hardship for the urban poor. So, what is the relevance of this particular article from the perspective of the UPSC mains examination? Now, let's say in the UPSC mains examination, you come across a particular question which requires you to carry out a critical analysis of the role of Indian judiciary in India. So while writing the answers to such question, you can quote the Supreme Court judgment in the MC Mehta versus Union of India case. Apart from that, in GS paper 1, you have a separate topic related to the slums. Now, while writing an answer related to the slum redevelopment, you can quote this particular judgment of Sudama Singh and others versus Government of Delhi, wherein it has been highlighted that in order to carry out the slum relocation, a survey must be carried out, a rehabilitation plan has to be brought out, and the slum dwellers as such have to be engaged meaningfully in order to formulate such a rehabilitation plan. So these are some of the important aspects which one should know with respect to this particular article. The next article appears on page number 1 and is titled as Streets for People Challenge launched. Now this particular article highlights that the Union Housing and Urban Affairs Ministry has launched a new initiative which is referred to as the Streets for People Challenge. The idea behind this particular initiative is to make the Indian cities more pedestrian friendly and to provide for the safer means of transport along with the social distancing. Now this particular challenge, which is organized by the Smart Cities Mission, is not just limited to the 100 smart cities, but it also includes all the cities which have a population of over 5 lakhs. Now, apart from the Streets for People challenge, this particular article also highlights that the Union Housing and Urban Affairs Ministry has launched the Climate Smart Cities Assessment Framework 2.0. So let us understand in detail about the Climate Smart Cities Assessment Framework. See, in the last decade or so, the Indian cities have been facing the growing threat of the climate change. This is evident in the increase in the frequency of cyclones, floods, heat waves, water scarcity, and drought-like conditions that have had an adverse impact on many of our cities. Such kind of extreme events and risks not only cause the loss of life, but it has an adverse impact on the growing urbanization within India. In this particular context, the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs has launched the Climate Smart Cities Assessment Framework 2.0. The basic idea behind this particular framework is to serve as a roadmap for the Indian cities in order to combat and mitigate the impact of the climate change. So what basically we are doing under this particular framework is here we are measuring as to what all steps the cities across India have taken with respect to improving the urban climate and promote sustainable development. Now, for example, under this particular framework, we are measuring the performance of the cities in terms of mainly 5 sectors, that is energy and green buildings, urban planning, urban mobility and air quality, water management, waste management, and so on. Under each of these sectors, we consider further indicators in order to check whether the Indian cities have been able to mitigate and adapt to the climate change. For example, as part of the energy and green buildings, we are looking at the share of the renewable energy in the total electricity consumption in a particular city. We are looking at the initiatives taken in the city in order to promote the energy efficiency, street lighting, the promotion of green buildings. Similarly, as part of the urban planning, we are checking as to what extent the cities have made a provision for the increase in the green cover, the initiatives taken by their cities in order to improve the disaster resilience. Similarly, in order to improve the air quality, we are seeing as to what extent the cities have been able to introduce the pedestrian and bicycles. Similarly, other indicators are used with respect to water management as well as the waste management. See, as far as the sectors as well as indicators which are being considered to rank the cities is not that important for the prelims examination. However, let's say in mains examination, you come across a question as to what steps can be taken by the Indian cities in order to withstand the impact of climate change and promote sustainable development. In that particular case, you can simply highlight these actions which can be taken by the Indian cities in order to promote sustainable development. Wherein under these five broad sectors, you can highlight each of these points in order to write the answers to such a question. Apart from that, from the perspective of prelims examination, one needs to be aware about the National Action Plan on Climate Change. This is so because the Climate Smart Cities Assessment Framework 2.0 is part of the National Mission on Sustainable Habitat. Now, this mission has in turn three programs, that is the Amrut program, Swachh Bharat mission, as well as the Smart Cities mission. So apart from the National Mission on Sustainable Habitat, one needs to be aware about the other national missions as well, such as the Green India Mission, National Water Mission, National Solar Mission, National Mission for the Enhanced Energy Efficiency, and so on. Now, for example, in the earlier prelims, questions have been asked with respect to both National Water Mission as well as the Green India Mission. So this particular topic is quite important for your upcoming prelims examination. So the write-up about this particular topic has been provided in the PDF for your reference. I hope you would be able to go through the PDF and understand this particular aspect on your own. The next article appears on page number 1. Now this particular article highlights that the index of industrial production, which measures the volume of industrial production, this index has shrunk by almost around 10.4% in July 2020 in comparison to July 2019. Now, if you look at the value of index of industrial production in the month of June 2020, this was around 15.7%. So there has been a marginal improvement in the index of industrial production. However, the improvement in the index of industrial production is not along the expected lines, since the economists had expected a sharp recovery of the industrial production in July 2020. Now, if you look at the previous year prelims questions have been repeatedly asked with respect to both index of industrial production as well as the index of 8 core industries. So before you go to the analysis of this particular article, I would advise you to test yourself through these questions. Now basically in case of India, we have two indices in order to measure the volume of industrial production. One is the index of industrial production and the other is index of 8 core industries. The index of industrial production is actually published by the National Statistical Office, whereas the index of 8 core industries is actually published by the Office of Economic Advisor, which functions under the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. So please do note that the publishing agencies for these two indices are different. However, the base year which has been considered for the calculation of these two indices is same, and that is 2011-12. Now when we measure the index of industrial production, this can be measured both in terms of sector-based classification as well as a goods-based classification. Now for measuring IIP, we take into account the three sectors, that is mining, manufacturing and electricity, and the highest weightage is given to the manufacturing sector. As far as the goods-based classification is concerned, we take into account the primary goods, intermediate goods, capital goods, infrastructure or construction goods, consumer durables, consumer non-durables, and out of these categories of goods, the highest weightage is given to the primary goods, whereas the lowest weightage is given to the capital goods. As far as the index of 8 core industries are concerned, here we take into account certain core industries which are considered to be quite critical for the overall economic growth and development of India. Now, these 8 core industries as such constitute almost around 40.27% of the weightage which has been assigned under the Index of Industrial Production. Now, these core sectors are coal, crude oil, natural gas, petroleum refinery products, fertilizers, steel, cement, as well as electricity. Now, in one of the earlier prelims question, you are required to identify as to which sector is a core sector. Accordingly, you need to remember all of these 8 sectors which are considered as the 8 core sectors. Further, out of these 8 core sectors, the highest weightage has been assigned to the petroleum products, whereas the lowest weightage has been assigned to the fertilizer production. Now, the answers to the questions that we had presented before the start of the discussion is as presented on the screen. With this, let us now take up the next article. Now, today's lead article in the Hindu newspaper is titled as Game of Chess in the Himalayas, and it appears on page number 6. Now, this particular lead article has appeared in the newspaper in the context of the Indo-China border dispute along the line of actual control. Now, this particular lead article first and foremost gives us a historical background to the Indo-China border dispute. Then it discusses as to what extent the present border standoff is similar to the standoff prior to the 1962 Indo-China war. Then it highlights that whatever strategy which China is following presently, the strategy which it terms as the strategy of strategic dominance, this particular strategy is similar to the strategy followed by China even prior to the 1962 war. So accordingly, this particular article highlights that basically India has 2 options. Option 1 is to walk into the trap which China has been laying down through its strategy of the strategic dominance, or learn from its past mistake which it has committed during the 1962 war. Now, the various aspects related to this particular lead article have been covered in much greater detail in our previous DNS videos. For example, in our DNS dated 23rd of October 2019, Mangal sir had discussed in detail about the historical background to the Indo-China border dispute. Then next on 22nd June 2020, Navid sir had discussed as to what extent the present border standoff is similar to the 1962. Then in our DNS dated 29th of May 2020, Navid sir had once again discussed as to what is the present China strategy to deal with the line of actual control. So I would advise you to read this particular lead article on your own and try to understand. In case of any kind of clarification, you can simply go through these previous DNS. With this, we have come to end of today's discussion. Now let us have a look at the question for the day.